Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 10 not quite greatest conductors ever. There we go, jazz hands, who just missed the 20 greatest conductors list. These are conductors who made wonderful recordings, sometimes lots of wonderful recordings, but they either haven't worn well or they vitiated their own reputations by making too many versions of the same things, or they had some strange, twitchy things happening in their lives that just prevented them from ranking up there with the top. Lots of things we can talk about. And here they are. You ready? Number one. Well, these are not in any order, because none of these lists were in any order. Ernest Ansermet. I mean, people loved Ansermet. He was Decca's house conductor. He recorded tons and tons and tons of stuff. He was very good in French music. He was very good with Stravinsky. He had some surprises in the German repertoire and in things like Sibelius's Fourth that some of you mentioned recently. But here is the but. He could be interpretively rather strange and cold, precise, but occasionally less than expressively ideal, number one. And number two, he had a second-rate orchestra. And it was always second-rate. He wasn't an orchestra trainer in the sense that people like, Toscanini or some of these other folks who could really whip a band into shape, George Sell, right? Reiner. It just wasn't his thing. And so, although some of his recordings sound marvelous, and he did a lot of Russian music, and it was he hasn't worn all that well, quite frankly. I enjoy his recordings, I really do. I have a fondness for them, but I can't be foolish and say, well, golly gee, there isn't better in that repertoire. So it's just unfortunately the way it sometimes shakes out. The fact that somebody made lots and lots and lots of records, and this is a mantra we'll be coming back to as we go through this list, doesn't mean that they were the greatest ever. It just means they were prolific. And those recordings have to be compared honestly to the best of the competition. And when you do that, Ansermet comes out as very good. He's very good, but not one of the, most powerful or compelling. So there you go. The sad fact, he's only almost great, which is really actually pretty damn good when you think about it. Another one who's similar, only on the German side, was Karl Böhm. Now, some of you mentioned him too. He did amazing things. He was a wonderful Mozart conductor. He was a terrific opera conductor. I mean, he did a sensational Wagner Ring. I mean, we know that. But he also was kind of stodgy. I mean, he could be. And in Beethoven and he did a little bit of Haydn, and he did Brahms. He did all of those German standards, but nobody had much love for them. Some of his Beethoven, yes. I mean, I'd go there. His Brahms, I like his Brahms, actually. I kind of like that sort of Teutonic, four-square approach to it. And he did a good third, which is kind of cool because most people screw up the third. And later in his life, he started to enjoy people like Tchaikovsky. That was like pornography if you were a German conductor of his ilk. And he made, his Richard Strauss recordings of operas were superb. His tone poems weren't as good. They really weren't. And so, but he deserves credit for putting Die Frau und Schatten on the map as Strauss's greatest opera. So, I mean, he gets a lot of love for that. But overall, again, we come back to the fact that wonderful though many of his recordings were, and they were. I mean, no question that they were. Especially his Mozart, which is really, really beautiful and very tender and giving and warm and, humane. It was lovely. There were other people who were doing the same stuff, and they were doing it as well or better, particularly in the symphonic repertoire. So we just have to call it like we hear it. And we just did. I have an itch. Excuse me. Oh, my goodness. There we go. Next, Rafael Kubelik. Now, I happen to love Rafael Kubelik. I love his Dvorak, his Czech music, his Janacek. And, he did Martinu. And he was a very passionate and spontaneous musician. He did Smetana's Mavlas 7 or 8 times. Who knows? The thing about Kubelik is that he was very patchy. He was very hit and miss for his whole career. I mean, he did incredible Bartok Concerto for Orchestra, but you never quite knew what you were going to get. And so because of that sort of lack of consistency, and he didn't get acclaim actually in the areas where he really soared, like he was an amazing Wagner conductor. You know, that Meistersinger and the Parsifal that were never released because of licensing issues, you know, and rights issues, that finally came out and showed that he was like incredible. He did weird German operas wonderfully. He did he didn't do Dr. Faustus, but he did Palestrina, and he did Mathis der Mahler, and, you know, there were wonderful, wonderful things that he did. Like I said, like all of these guys. But there were also a lot of things that he did that aren't as wonderful as the things that other people competing did. So there you go. You could have maybe ranked him with the great specialists, I suppose, because of his Dvorak and Janacek. But just putting those two composers together, it's not enough. It's not enough. If he'd really gone crazy in Czech music the way Jean Martinon did with French music, with a wide range of composers and all kinds of pieces, then I would have said, yeah, we could lump him with the specialists, because he would have done it marvelously. But he didn't. I mean, he wasn't given that opportunity. He was in Bavaria with Bavarian radio for most of his career, and Deutsche Grammophon didn't see a market for that kind of music, for exploring, you know, the range of Czech contemporary music, which really would have been kind of fun. He could have done Fibic symphonies if he wanted. He could have done Vítězslav Novak. You know, he could have done more of Suk, some of which he did for Bavarian radio, but it wasn't released on commercial discs, at least not right away. So yeah, Kubelik had his ups and downs, and so he almost makes the list. Same is true of Ferenc Fricsay. Now, Fricsay, I think, was unquestionably one of the great conductors of the 20th century. A lot of his work is in mono, especially his Bartók, which, boy, if it had been in stereo, like the piano concertos were with Géza Anda, we would have really had something. And his Beethoven was stunning, and his Mozart was fabulous, and his choral music generally, I mean, his Verdi Requiems, there are 2 of them, were just wonderful. But they were mostly in mono, and besides that, he died too young. I mean, his Tchaikovsky Pathetique, his Dvorak New World Symphony, for a guy who didn't live long and who didn't make that many stereo recordings, his success rate is off the charts. It really is. But there just wasn't enough of it compared to the others. So you have to understand, it's not that if you take him in isolation, you couldn't say he was one of the greatest ever. I do. You know, freely I do. But when you're making a list, this is the thing. You know, a lot of these other lists that we see, like that stupid BBC list that started this whole conversation, there's no thought behind it. But if you take it seriously, if you try to take it seriously and give some real thought as to what's on and what's off and what the criteria are, then you have to make some hard decisions. And Fricsay is one of those hard decisions, because however wonderful his work was, there are others on the specialist and generalist list who were equally wonderful in their way and who had more or other. And so they get a little bit of a leg up on Fricsay. But boy, let's not forget about him. Another one, this one may be a little controversial, James Levine. You know, he gets, forget the sexual stuff for a minute, you know, his disgrace in his later career, and the fact that he conducted everything at 1/8 the tempo it should have happened. It was horrible. But, I mean, his Boston career was a disaster, and it was terrible. But the fact of the matter is, he stayed at the Met for virtually his whole career. How long was he there? 30 years, 40 years? I don't know. It's just forever. He made them one of the world's great orchestras. He was terrific in the entire range of operatic repertory. You know, I say that you know, opera conductors don't count because they're accompanists. But Levine was more than that, because he also had a career as a symphonic conductor. And although it was generally poo-pooed, some of it was fantastic. His Brahms symphony cycles are 2 of the greatest ever on RCA and on Deutsche Grammophon with Chicago and with Vienna. His Mahler was extraordinarily fine. His Schumann was terrific. He did his Stravinsky. My God, he did a recording of Les Noces and Petrushka that was unbelievable. People don't pay much attention. And he made recordings with the Met Orchestra, some of which were very good, some of which were not so good, later in his career. But it was a great orchestra. And it was his creation. He deserves full credit for that. I mean, probably in the United States, he was the most important orchestra builder since George Szell. And maybe Ormandy, but Ormandy inherited a great orchestra from Stokowski, so I don't know. But, one of them. He was definitely one of them. And I just think that, in terms of quality, the level of his work was really exceptional. And nobody cares. So there you go. Nobody cared while he was alive. I mean, he was just there. It was like, oh, it's James Levine. It's going to be good. His Verdi was going to be good. All of his Italian stuff was good. He was just going to be good. His German stuff was good. It was really good. So I'm not putting him in with the top 20, but boy, it's a close thing. Absolutely a close thing. And of all the opera conductors out there, he's probably at the top. And so there. Next, Paul Paray. Well, what can we say about Paul Paray? He was a jolly French guy, and everybody loved him. He had an orchestra in Detroit, which was not top-notch, but which was quite good. He had Mercury Living Presence making fabulous-sounding recordings that still sound fabulous, and he made a lot of them. So there's an extensive discography, and in his specialized French repertoire, he was wonderful. But there was also, he did that Sibelius too, which is faster than hell, but amazing. And his Schumann symphonies turned out to be shockingly fine. He could do a lot more, and he had the opportunity occasionally to do that, which was wonderful. So I don't think anybody could rank him with the best of the best, even in the French repertoire, where lots of other people doing it. Could you say he was better than like Pierre Boulez or Jean Martineau? I don't think so. I really don't. But he was pretty terrific. And he did a lot of unusual French repertoire that you couldn't find at the time. Chabrier and Florent Schmitt and all kinds of nifty things if you burrow into his discography a little bit. So, yeah, give him props. And his own mass, the Joan of Arc mass, which is gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. So he's great. Definitely great, but not the greatest, not in the top 20, nor is Bernard Haitink, which a lot of you mentioned. Haitink, I have to be, I'm a little annoyed with, because Haitink shot himself in the foot. He shot himself in the foot by, later in his career, his if you have the big Phillips box of his stuff, it's beautiful. There's so much beautiful playing, so much wonderful stuff. The Tchaikovsky, some of the Bruckner, a lot of the Mahler, it's just terrific. But he wasn't consistent in any of that repertoire. He really wasn't. His Beethoven and Brahms were boring, just plain boring, except for the first serenade, which is stunning. And his Shostakovich symphonies have their hits and misses. The thing about Haitink is that he was great at pieces that needed special pleading, like the Shostakovich 12th, or like the Brahms First Serenade, or pieces that don't get the Bizet Symphony in C. There were these things he did, and he would do them so beautifully. But at the surefire German standards, he was far less reliable. And then at the end of his life, he just kept doing the same stuff over and over again with these orchestras, and they would release them on their own labels. And so you had him doing just endless quantities of Bruckner and Mahler, most of it pretty mediocre. So where are we? They just released from like the 1980s a fabulous Bavarian Radio Dvorak 7th. Great, good for him. But he didn't really have much feeling for Dvorak. He didn't do much other Dvorak. He was limited in some ways in his repertoire, and then he squandered, I think, what he had later in his career, because I don't think he really cared about his recordings. I really don't. He talked about people making too many records and all that stuff, but then he went and did it himself. All of which means that he just let things happen, and he wasn't a particularly careful or observant or concerned custodian of his legacy. And so there you go. He misses the top 20. Could have been in there. I mean, you could be selective. If you pick and choose, you could find enough probably to make the argument. But we have to go by the entire profligate panorama of what he actually recorded. And there you go. Furtwängler. Okay. Now, this is controversial because some people think Furtwängler was the greatest thing that ever because, first of all, I don't think you're the greatest ever because you do German repertoire well. And that's all that he did. There is nothing in the non-German repertoire, except maybe a Paray symphony from the 1930s, that Furtwängler did that is great. Unquestionably great and best in show. So, I mean, he did some of that stuff. Yes, there's like Sibelius and there's Ravel. It's horrible. It's all horrible. But I don't believe that just because you do Beethoven symphonies or Brahms symphonies particularly well, or Wagner or an occasional Tristan, that makes you one of the greatest conductors ever. I don't think the repertoire is the point. I think that your success in performing it is the point. And Furtwängler's success was, I mean, he was the most hit and miss conductor that ever lived. He could be incredibly thrilling. There are individual performances, live performances, that Hamburg Brahms First, which is like astounding, and, you know, his Schubert Ninth, just wonderful, wonderful performances. But very few, you know, you can get them on, a dozen maybe. And the same things over and over and over again, with varying degrees of slovenliness. And really, to his credit, he didn't like making recordings. He was not often in the studio. And most of these live recordings and broadcasts and things he did not authorize for release, and he probably wouldn't have had he been alive. So that's not entirely his fault. But his body of work speaks for itself. And it speaks of a musician who had fabulous aspirations and only the modest ability to succeed in those aspirations. And I have absolutely no issue with people who just decide that they love him to death. They can love him to death. But like I said in one of my t-shirts, you can love things that suck. Just admit it. Just admit it. He does not belong, based on his entire body of work, with the greatest. So much of his reputation, too, is based on word of mouth, based on people who heard him live and report how fabulous he was in concert and how thrilling his performances were live. And I believe all of that. But the recordings don't substantiate it. So that's a fact. There you go. Next, Claudio Abbado. He's another one. A lot of you mentioned him, too. He made tons and tons and tons and tons of records, and half of them suck. I mean, that's a real problem. It really is. His best recordings were mostly made with the London Symphony when he was youngish. His Berlin stuff was horribly hit and miss. The best thing he did was the Brahms cycle. He was a fabulous conductor in some Verdi operas, and Rossini operas particularly. He was tremendous. He had his virtues. He had many virtues. But he also had a very strange attitude toward his recordings. I mean, he recorded Il Viaggio a Reims for DG. It was a world premiere. It was thrilling. And then he did the same thing for Sony with half of the same cast. I mean, and why? I mean, what was his thought process? He would do the stuff over and over again. He was never, he was wonderful in the Brahms in the second Beethoven cycle in Berlin, but there were 3 Beethoven cycles or 2 Beethoven cycles before that were just, meh. You know, his Vienna recordings were also pretty average. His Mahler, some people swear by, especially the Lucerne recordings, which I think, frankly, people are delusional because it's not a great orchestra. First of all, just because it has great players doesn't mean it's a great orchestra. And number one, and number two, those performances are spotty and micromanaged and somewhat indifferently recorded. And oh my goodness, you have to be crazy. And then there's just this enormous box with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of recordings. If you take the best of what he did and put it in a box, you could still probably get, I don't know, maybe 100 recordings, 75 recordings, and you could say, well, he was one of the top 20. And I wouldn't argue. I really wouldn't, because at his best, he was superb. He really was, but he was not often at his best. And we have to look at the entire legacy. And there you go. And that is also true, even more true, of the last person on our list, good old Georg Solti, the Grammy champion. Everything he did, he got a Grammy. He got tons of Grammys. He won awards, award after award after award. He was a brutal, insensitive, don't know what else to say. He wasn't a hack. I mean, he wasn't. I like some of what he did. I mean, he did lovely Brahms. He did some great Bruckner. His Beethoven cycle's pretty good. He was an excellent choral and opera conductor. He has wonderful operas and wonderful, choral works in Chicago, particularly. So, yes, there are wonderful things. He did very, very good Bartók with the LSO, not so much with Chicago. And there's another case where a guy remakes things, and each time it gets worse. His Mahler remakes were almost all dreadful. Some of them weren't so good to begin with. But, he had the opportunity to make tons and tons of records. And just because he made tons of records, that does not mean he was one of the greatest ever. However much the labels pushed him, and however often they convinced music listeners who probably didn't have access to the widest range of discography of the works in question, they were willing to drink the Kool-Aid and believe what they were told about how wonderful he was. He was exciting. He really was. I mean, he was usually exciting, except in slow movements where he could be quite deathly dull. But he was usually pretty exciting. Let's put it that way. And because of that, his music making had an energy, a visceral energy, that was really pretty impressive sometimes. But it also lacked impact, strangely enough, when you compare it to the best of what other people were doing. So, Solti made lots and lots of records. Doesn't mean they were great records. Doesn't mean he was a great conductor. He did some great things. He had the opportunity. I mean, let's face it. When you make as many recordings as some of these people did, a few dozen of them have to be fabulous, right? And they were. I mean, they were. These people were not incompetents. They weren't terrible. They just weren't as great as the great. And now you know, unquestionably, and without any sort of demur. Yeah, demure is something else, right? Anyway, without any qualification, who the really great ones are. Enjoy them, and enjoy the rest of these guys too. But be selective. That's all I'm saying about these things. You got to pick and choose. You got to be critical. You got to keep on listening. So thanks for joining me, friends. Take care.